Ecological succession. In this session, we're talking about ecological succession, primary succession, secondary succession, pond succession, and primary versus secondary succession. So how do we define ecological succession? Well, it's natural, gradual changes in the types of species that live in an area, and it can be primary or secondary. It's the gradual replacement of one plant community by another through natural processes over time. And you can see here, we're going to start with our sandy dune over here on the left. We're going to get to these basic bushes in the middle, and we're going to end with our tree forest on the right-hand side. Let's start with primary succession. It begins in a place without any soil. That can be things like bare rock, sides of volcanoes, post-landslides, and flooded areas. In this case here, we have some bare rock. Could have been created by a landslide, not quite sure, but it is bare rock. There's no soil currently. And it's going to start with the arrival of living things such as lichens, which are fungus, that do not need soil to survive. And these are called pioneer species. So for everything else to come, we're going to need some soil. Now our pioneer species don't need that soil, so they're going to arrive first. And when they get there, them, alongside the forces of nature, like weather and erosion, are going to help break the rocks down into smaller pieces. They're going to create some gaps. And when they decompose, they're going to fill those gaps with their organic matter. And that's going to add small amounts of organic matter to the rock, which will eventually create soil. Simple plants like mosses and ferns can grow in the new soil. So we're going to have our bare rock, and all along is going to come our lichens. Now they don't need soil to survive. Now when they die, their organic matter is going to be added to the rock. And this rock is going to be slightly broken down through weathering and erosion. So what's going to happen is you're going to get a really thin layer of soil on the rock where the lichens once were. And that soil is mostly going to be made up of the organic matter from the lichens, as well as other debris that gets blown into that area. Now, from that very basic amount of soil, you're going to get your very simple species starting to grow, your mosses and your ferns. Now, when these simple plants die, more organic matter is going to be added to the area. This is going to thicken our layer of soil. As the soil layer thickens, grasses and other wildflowers are going to be able to grow, and they're going to start taking over. These plants die, adding more nutrients to the soil. From these nutrients, we can now start growing things like shrubs and small trees. So now you see we're going to start building larger and larger, more complex organisms in the area. Now that we have a nice layer of soil and some plants growing, insects, small birds, and other mammals begin to move in. There's places for them to live. There's other organisms for them to eat, etc. So what was once bare rock now supports a variety of life. Now that's primary succession. Primary succession is when there's no soil to begin with. Secondary succession begins in an area where soil is already present. So for example, a clear-cut forest or following a forest fire. So an example of secondary succession is pond succession. So let's go through pond succession. As the pond develops, birds and land animals come to inhabit the pond. These are the pond pioneers. As more creatures arrive, the debris on the bottom increases. Water plants appear and soon grow all along the bottom. Emergent plants, which are plants that are rooted and stand above the water surface, grow around the water's edge. Over time, as pond plants grow, die, and decompose, layers of debris build up. These layers of decaying matter raise the pond floor over the years. After some time, the pond floor is close enough to the bottom that emergent plants grow all the way across the floor, creating a marsh. The marsh continues to fill in with dirt and debris. Eventually, trees grow in the water. It's now a swamp. Over time, the swamp can dry out and the land becomes a forest or a grassland. So let's draw what that's going to look like. So first, we're going to start with a basic pond. And we're going to draw in some animals and some basic plants that typically live around the edges. So that's our number one. Number two says water plants appear and grow along the bottom. Emergent plants grow around the water's edge. So now we're going to see very similar plants along the outside. A few more are going to grow. And we're going to start growing along the bottom as well. Now keep in mind, this pond is still filled with water. So that's water, and that's still water. So our plants and our animals are eventually going to die and decompose, creating a layer of debris along the pond floor. And now we're going to start getting a layer that's going to kind of make our pond floor go up a little higher. So it's going to look something like that. Emergent plants grow all the way across now, creating a marsh. The marsh continues to fill with dirt and debris. Eventually, trees start growing in the water. So you can imagine the more trees and stuff that are there, the more dirt that's going to be trapped, the more animals that are going to go there, the more they're going to decompose, etc. So eventually we're going to see something that looks like this. But it's still going to have water in it. So over time, the swamp can eventually dry out, and the land becomes a forest or a grassland. So instead of a pond, now what we're going to see is more of a solid ground that goes all the way across, with grass growing up, and trees and animals everywhere. So let's go through a few terms. Pioneer species, that's the first species to begin a succession. The climax community is the final stage in the succession. So our pioneer species for our primary succession would be our lichen, and our climax community would be our forest trees. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and compare primary and secondary succession. What are the differences? So make a chart that looks something like this, and compare the two of them. In your comparison, you should have seen something along the lines of primary having no soil and secondary having some soil. Since the soil already exists, our seeds are going to have suitable soil conditions to begin with right away. Primary, you're going to have your pioneer species, and it's going to be much slower. So we could say either slower on the primary side or faster on the secondary side. And then both of them are actually going to end with a climax community. So assuming all that makes sense, you'll have completed the lesson on ecological succession.